Stop seeking validation. It's destroying your self-respect. You check your phone and there's nothing, no message, no reaction, no sign that anyone noticed you. And somehow that changes how you feel about yourself. Not loudly, not all at once, but quietly. It chips away at something inside you. Your confidence, your sense of worth, your self-respect. You start adjusting. What you say, how you act, how much of yourself you show. Just enough to be accepted. Just enough to be liked, but never fully you. And the strange part is you don't even notice when it starts. You think you're just being careful, more aware, more socially intelligent, but what you're actually doing is slowly abandoning yourself. Because every time you look outside to decide how you should feel inside, you give something away, and you don't get it back. This is the trap of seeking validation. It doesn't break you all at once. It trains you to stop trusting your own voice. And the more you do it, the harder it becomes to hear yourself at all. So let me ask you something. When was the last time you made a decision without needing someone else to approve it? If that question feels uncomfortable, this might be exactly what you need to hear. The approval habit you don't notice. Most people who seek validation don't know they're doing it. That's the first thing to understand, and it's also the thing that makes this pattern so difficult to interrupt. Because it doesn't present itself as need, it presents itself as intelligence, as social awareness, as the reasonable act of someone who simply pays attention to how things land before they speak. You think twice before sending the message. You soften the opinion before you voice it. You read the expression on someone's face mid-sentence and quietly adjust your position before you've even finished the thought. And in the moment, none of that feels like fear. It feels like maturity. But here's what's actually happening beneath all of that careful management. Your brain has made a calculation, one it made so early and so automatically that it no longer feels like a calculation at all. The calculation goes like this. Acceptance equals safety. Rejection equals threat. And the fastest way to secure acceptance is to monitor, adjust, and calibrate before the threat has a chance to materialize. This is not a character flaw. It is a learned behavior, one that began long before you had the language to question it. Think about the first time you said something true, something you actually believed, and watched it land wrong. Maybe someone laughed. Maybe someone went quiet. And in that moment, the mind registered it. Unfiltered equals risk. And from that point forward, a small internal editor began its work. Marcus Aurelius wrote in the Meditations, Book 4, that the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. What you practice consistently, you eventually become. And if what you have been practicing quietly, across hundreds of small interactions, is the suppression of your unfiltered self in exchange for approval, then at some point, that suppression stops being a behavior and starts being a baseline. You stop noticing the gap between what you think and what you say, because the gap has been there long enough to feel normal. You stop noticing the hesitation before you speak, because the hesitation has become part of how you process thought. Epictetus, in the Enchiridion, makes a distinction that cuts directly to the center of this. He separates what is up to us from what is not. What is not up to us, what never was and never will be, is how others receive us, what they think, whether they approve. The approval habit is, at its core, a sustained attempt to control something that is not yours to control. And the energy required to maintain that attempt is energy not going toward anything real. That is what makes it exhausting in a way that's hard to explain. It's not the social interaction itself that drains you, it's the labor that happens before, during, and after. The pre-editing, the live adjustment, the post-conversation review, that loop, that quiet audit of your own performance, you know exactly what that feels like. And the reason it keeps happening is that the habit was never built for your comfort. It was built for your survival. So the loop continues. The habit stays invisible, and the gap between who you are and who you present keeps widening, so gradually that you mistake the distance for depth. Why validation feels like safety. There's a question most people never think to ask about this pattern, not, why do I care what people think? That one comes up. The question that actually matters is deeper. It's this: why does the absence of approval feel like danger? Not disappointment, not discomfort, danger. Because if you pay close attention, that's exactly what it feels like. When the message goes unanswered too long. When you say something and the room shifts in a way you didn't expect. There's something underneath that discomfort that feels less like hurt feelings and more like threat. That feeling is not irrational. It is ancient. The human brain didn't evolve for independence. It evolved for belonging. For most of human history, exclusion from the group wasn't a social inconvenience. It was a death sentence, and the mind learned to treat rejection with the same urgency it reserved for physical harm. You are not weak because approval feels important. You are responding to a system built long before you had any say in it. But here is where it gets complicated. That same ancient mechanism has been redirected away from real threats and towards social performance. Your nervous system cannot distinguish between being excluded from the tribe and being left on red. The signal is the same. The urgency is the same. Epictetus wrote in the Enchiridion that men are disturbed not by what happens to them, but by their opinions about what happens. The suffering caused by disapproval isn't located in the disapproval itself. It's located in what you've decided disapproval means. And most people have decided, without ever consciously deciding, that disapproval is evidence. Evidence that something is wrong with them. That belief is the engine underneath the behavior. And the more you rely on external approval to feel okay, the less capable you become of generating that feeling from within. What feels like safety in the short term is instability in disguise, because the approval you receive today can be withdrawn tomorrow. And if your sense of self depends on it, that withdrawal affects how you feel about yourself. That's the trap. And the exit isn't more approval. It's something harder than that. The invisible trade you keep making. Every time you seek validation, you make a trade. You probably don't frame it that way, it doesn't feel like a transaction. But underneath the social reasoning, something is being exchanged, and the terms of that exchange are rarely examined. You give up a piece of authenticity. In return, you receive acceptance, and in the moment that feels like a reasonable deal. The adjustment was small, nobody noticed. The conversation moved forward without friction, but the cost doesn't appear immediately. It accumulates, quietly. In micro-concessions so small that no single one feels significant, you don't say the thing you actually think, just this once, because the timing isn't right. You agree with something you don't fully believe, just to keep the peace. You present a softened version of your opinion to avoid the look on someone's face that makes you feel like you've said too much. Each concession feels minor, reasonable even. But they compound, and what compounds over time becomes structure. Carl Jung described this process with uncomfortable precision. In The Undiscovered Self, he wrote about the persona, the mask constructed through social interaction, shaped by what the environment rewards and what it punishes. The persona is not dishonesty. It begins as adaptation. But when adaptation becomes the default, when the mask is worn so consistently that you forget there's a face beneath it, something essential has been lost. You don't lose yourself all at once. You lose yourself in the accumulation of small trades you stopped noticing you were making. The most revealing sign is subtle. It's the moment you say, "I don't mind," when you clearly do. The moment you hear your own voice agreeing with something and feel somewhere underneath the words a quiet resistance you chose to ignore. That resistance is important. It's not stubbornness. It's the part of you that still remembers what you actually think before the editing began. The problem isn't what you've lost in any single trade. The problem is what you've started to forget. And that forgetting, gradual and almost invisible, is far more costly than any single moment of disapproval ever could have been. You stop trusting your own mind. At some point, the editing stops being something you do and becomes something that happens to you. That's the shift most people never notice. In the beginning, the adjustment is conscious. You choose to soften the opinion. There's still a version of you that knows what it actually thinks, but over time, the choice disappears. The filter becomes automatic, and what was once a deliberate decision becomes the first step in how you process thought. You stop thinking and then editing. You start thinking already edited. This is what outsourced judgment looks like from the inside. Not confusion, not obvious self-doubt, just a quiet, persistent habit of checking, before you've even finished forming the thought, whether it will hold up under external scrutiny. And the more you check, the less you trust what you find. Every time you override your own instinct in favor of someone else's approval, you send yourself a message. The message is simple. Your judgment alone is not enough. It needs to be verified. And the mind begins to operate accordingly, generating doubt as a reflex, inserting hesitation as a default, treating your own conclusions as provisional until someone else has weighed in. Epictetus was direct about this in the Enchiridion. He wrote that we suffer not from events themselves, but from the judgments we place on them. And one of the most damaging judgments a person can carry is the quiet conviction that their own inner voice is unreliable. That conviction shows up in the way you handle decisions. Small ones first. You ask for opinions you didn't need. You delay choices that were already clear. And then, gradually, the same pattern migrates to larger things, to beliefs, to values, to the fundamental question of what kind of life you want. Marcus Aurelius returned to this in the Meditations, Book 3. He wrote about the importance of acting from your own rational nature, not from fear of what others will say. He understood that a mind constantly seeking external permission is a mind that has surrendered its most essential function. Not intelligence, not capability, but the willingness to trust itself. That willingness, once lost, is not easily recovered, because the doubt has been practiced, and practiced doubt feels indistinguishable from wisdom. The voice that gets replaced, your inner voice doesn't disappear. That's the part people don't expect. They imagine that losing yourself is dramatic, a sudden collapse, a clear moment of surrender. But it doesn't work that way. The voice doesn't go silent. It gets replaced, slowly, almost imperceptibly, by something that sounds similar enough that you stop noticing the difference. What replaces it? Other people's expectations, the reactions you've learned to anticipate, the version of you that has been consistently rewarded, the one that adjusts, agrees, softens, accommodates. That version becomes fluent, practiced, and practiced things feel natural. So the replacement voice starts to feel like yours. Carl Jung named this process with precision. He called it the construction of the persona, the social mask built through years of interaction. Jung was careful to say that the persona itself is not the problem. Every person needs a way to navigate social reality. The problem is identification. When you identify so completely with the mask that you forget it's a mask, you don't lose your identity dramatically. You simply stop looking for it. You begin to live as the acceptable version of yourself, not the real one. Here is the specific feeling that signals this has happened. You are in a conversation and someone asks what you think. And before you answer, there is a brief but unmistakable moment where you scan. Not your own thoughts, but the room, the person, the context. You're not retrieving your opinion. You're constructing one that fits. And it happens fast enough that it almost feels like thinking. But it isn't thinking, it's translating. Marcus Aurelius wrote in the Meditations, Book 4, that a man should have a fixed character, stable and coherent, recognizable to himself regardless of the circumstances around him. That kind of character is not built through performance. It's built through consistency, through repeated alignment between what you think and what you say. When that alignment breaks down, something quietly hollows out. You can feel it in the moments when you're alone and the performance has nowhere to go. The self that remains feels strangely unfamiliar, like a room you haven't been in for a long time. It hasn't left, but it's waiting. And the question is whether you're willing to do what it takes to hear it again. You start performing without realizing. There's a moment that happens in almost every social interaction, and most people never catch it. You walk into a room and something shifts, not dramatically, not consciously. But the version of you that enters that room is slightly different from the one that was alone 5 minutes ago. The posture changes, the vocabulary adjusts. The topics you'd naturally reach for get filtered through a quick, invisible assessment of what this particular audience will respond to well. At first, this seems like normal social flexibility, healthy even. That range is not the problem. The problem begins when the adjustments stop being conscious choices and start being automatic responses. When you're no longer deciding how to show up, but simply reacting to what each environment seems to require. That's the line between adaptation and fragmentation. Adaptation means you have a stable self that expresses differently across contexts. Fragmentation means the contexts are generating the self, and without them you're not entirely sure what's left. Jung described the fragmented persona as a kind of psychological splitting in the lived sense. The person who is confident at work and anxious at home, articulate with strangers and silent with family. Each version is real, but none of them is complete. You feel most uncomfortable when nothing is being asked of you, when there's no role to fill, no audience to read, no performance to calibrate. The silence of your own company starts to feel like a gap. Without external structure, you don't feel free. You feel unmoored. That discomfort in your own silence is not a personality trait. It's a symptom. Epictetus addressed this directly in the Discourses. He described the person who lives entirely for external impression as someone who has handed the keys of their own house to strangers. The house still stands, but nothing inside it belongs to the person living there anymore, because every choice of what to keep and what to remove has been made in reference to what visitors might think. Because the question isn't whether you perform. Everyone performs to some degree. The question is whether there's something underneath the performance that remains consistent, something that doesn't change based on who's watching. If the answer to that question feels uncertain, that uncertainty is not something to dismiss. It's exactly where the real work begins. The slow death of self-respect. Self-respect doesn't disappear in a single moment. There's no dramatic collapse, no clear turning point you could look back at and say, that's where it happened. It dissolves, gradually in increments so small that each one feels insignificant on its own. A compromise here, a silence there, a moment where you knew what you should have said and chose not to say it, not because you were wrong, but because the cost of being right felt too high. This is how self-respect actually erodes, not through betrayal, not through failure, through the accumulated weight of moments where you chose external approval over internal integrity, where you decided again and again, in small and seemingly reasonable ways, that being accepted was worth more than being honest with yourself. Marcus Aurelius wrote in the Meditations, Book 8, that a man who abandons his own standards to please others has already lost the most important thing. Not reputation, not relationships, but his relationship with his own rational nature. The Stoics called this integrity of character, the alignment between what you believe and how you act. It was not one virtue among many. It was the foundation on which every other virtue stood. When that foundation cracks, what you lose isn't visible from the outside. Your life can look entirely intact, which is part of what makes this so difficult to address. There's no external evidence to point to, no clear problem to solve, just a quiet, persistent sense that something is off, that the person moving through your life is slightly misaligned with the person you know yourself to be. That feeling has a name. It's the absence of self-respect, not the dramatic, recognizable absence. The subtle kind that shows up as a low-grade dissatisfaction with yourself that you can't fully explain. A reluctance to be alone with your own thoughts for too long. A tendency to keep seeking the next signal of approval, because the approval, at least, is something. It fills the space that self-respect used to occupy. But it doesn't hold, because approval is conditional and self-respect is not. And the painful truth is this: every time you compromise your integrity for acceptance, you also confirm the belief that drove the compromise in the first place, that your unfiltered self is not enough. That belief, reinforced repeatedly, becomes the lens through which you see yourself. And changing a lens you've been looking through for years begins with recognizing that the erosion was never inevitable. It happened through choices, which means it can be reversed through choices as well. The addiction. No one talks about. Nobody thinks of themselves as addicted to approval. The word addiction conjures images of substances, compulsions, obvious loss of control. Seeking validation looks nothing like that from the outside. It looks like caring about relationships, like the normal human desire to be liked and accepted. Nothing about it signals a problem, which is precisely why it functions so effectively as one. But look at the structure underneath the behavior. You post something, share something, say something, and then you wait. Not passively, actively. There's a low-level alertness running in the background, a quiet monitoring for the signal. The response, the reaction, the sign that it landed well. And when approval arrives, there's a brief but distinct release, a small settling, a moment of okayness that wasn't there before. That release is real, and the brain's reward system doesn't respond to satisfaction. It responds to the resolution of uncertainty. The moment the question, "How did that land?" gets answered. Because that resolution feels good, the brain begins to seek it. Not occasionally, systematically. Small confirmations lead to more seeking. More seeking leads to greater dependency on the signals, and greater dependency means the baseline, how you feel without any external input, drops. Seneca wrote in his letters to Lucilius, letter 7, that we should be careful about what we repeatedly expose ourselves to, because we absorb more than we realize. What you repeatedly practice, you eventually require. And if you have practiced reaching outward for confirmation long enough, the reaching becomes involuntary. You don't decide to seek approval, you simply find yourself seeking it, before you've had a chance to ask whether it's actually necessary. And here is the part that makes this genuinely difficult to address. The loop is self-reinforcing, not just when it succeeds, but also when it fails. When the approval doesn't come, when the reaction is lukewarm, the discomfort doesn't break the pattern, it intensifies it. The nervous system, now in a state of unresolved uncertainty, seeks resolution more urgently. The absence of approval doesn't free you from the need. It deepens it. That's the structure of the trap. And the exit is not willpower. It's not deciding to care less. It's understanding what the loop is actually offering you and recognizing that what it promises, it can never consistently deliver, because the okayness it produces is always temporary, always conditional, always dependent on a next cycle that hasn't happened yet. Real steadiness doesn't come from the next signal. It never did. You're not being seen, you're being shaped. There's a distinction most people never make, and it costs them more than they realize. When you seek validation, you tell yourself you want to be seen, recognized, understood. That desire is legitimate. It's human. There is nothing wrong with wanting to be seen. But what actually happens in the seeking is something different. Every reaction you receive teaches you something. Every approval signals, do more of this. Every silence or disapproval signals, do less of that. And if your behavior is consistently adjusting in response to what gets rewarded and what doesn't, then you are not being seen. You are being trained. Being seen means someone perceives who you actually are. Being shaped means the environment is gradually producing who you become. One is connection, the other is conditioning. When you are genuinely seen, you leave the interaction feeling more like yourself, more settled, more located in your own skin. When you are being shaped, you leave the interaction having moved slightly, often imperceptibly, toward whatever version of yourself produced the best response. Because the movement is small and because it felt like success in the moment, you don't register it as a loss. But it is a loss, a small one, added to all the other small ones. Epictetus described the person who lives entirely in response to external opinion as someone who has surrendered their own nature to be sculpted by others. Not through malice, not through force, simply through the consistent act of caring more about the reaction than about the reality underneath it. Think about the last time you changed something about how you presented yourself, not because you genuinely evolved, but because the previous version didn't get the response you wanted, the opinion you walked back, the interest you downplayed. You probably didn't frame it as being shaped. You framed it as learning. But growth moves towards something internal. Shaping moves towards something external. And the difference, though subtle in any single moment, becomes unmistakable over time. The question that follows is not comfortable. If the people whose approval you've been seeking suddenly stopped responding, would you still know who you are? Would you still know what you think, what you value, what you want? Or has the shaping gone deep enough that the original is no longer easy to locate? That question is not an accusation, it's a compass. And the discomfort it creates is not a sign that something is wrong with you. It's a sign that something important is still there, still capable of being found. But only if you stop letting others hold the chisel. The Stoic truth about control. There is a line in Epictetus that most people read once and move past too quickly. It appears in the very opening of the Enchiridion. He writes that some things are within our power and some things are not. Within our power, opinion, motivation, desire, aversion. Not within our power, body, reputation, and everything that is not our own action. Reputation is not within your power. What others think of you is not within your power. The reaction you receive when you speak, the approval you generate when you act, the impression you leave in someone else's mind, none of it is yours to control. It never was. And the Stoics were not being pessimistic about this. They were being precise, drawing a boundary around the domain of human agency with the kind of clarity that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. If the opinion of others is genuinely outside your control, not partially but structurally by nature, then every effort you have made to manage it, secure it, and maintain it has been effort aimed at a target that was never within range. Think about the energy that goes into seeking approval on any given day, the pre-editing of thoughts before they're spoken, the post-conversation review of how things landed. All of that is real energy directed entirely towards something you cannot control and therefore cannot secure. Marcus Aurelius returned to this in the Meditations, Book 6. He wrote that you have power over your mind, not over external events, and that recognizing this is the beginning of strength, not the admission of weakness. The Stoic is not someone who stops caring. The Stoic is someone who stops spending themselves on what was never theirs to manage. When you stop trying to control the uncontrollable, that energy doesn't disappear. It returns. It becomes available for something that is actually within your power, your own thinking, your own choices, your own consistency between what you value and how you act. The anxiety doesn't come from caring about people. It comes from confusing caring about people with needing their approval. You can be fully present in a relationship, fully invested in someone's well-being, without tying your sense of self to whether they approve of you. One is love, the other is dependency. You are never going to control what they think, but you have always had complete authority over who you choose to be, where your power actually is. Most people understand intellectually that they can't control what others think. They've heard it, they've nodded at it, but understanding something intellectually and actually living from it are two entirely different things, because if the insight were enough on its own, the pattern would have already changed. The fact that it hasn't points to something important. The problem is not a lack of information, it's a lack of practice. Marcus Aurelius wrote in the Meditations, Book 2, that you have power over your mind, not over external events. But he didn't write that once and consider the matter closed. He returned to it again and again, across years of private writing never intended for anyone else to read. He wasn't performing wisdom. He was practicing it, drilling it into himself through repetition, because he understood that insight without repetition doesn't become character. It becomes a thought you had once. Real confidence, not the performed kind, not the kind that requires a favorable audience to sustain itself, is built the same way every other durable thing is built. Through repeated action in a specific direction. Through the accumulation of small moments where you chose your own judgment over external confirmation, where you spoke without softening, decided without consulting, held your position without needing it validated before you'd allow yourself to stand in it. Epictetus described this in the Discourses as the practice of returning to yourself, not a dramatic return, a quiet, consistent one. Each time the attention drifts outward, each time the monitoring begins, the practice is simply to notice it and redirect, not with force, with intention. This is also where self-respect regenerates. Because self-respect is not a feeling you wait to receive. It's a consequence of behavior, specifically the behavior of treating your own judgment as trustworthy enough to act on. The practical reality of this is unglamorous. The first time you say the true thing without softening it, you will feel exposed. The first time you make the decision without consulting, you will feel uncertain. But the discomfort is temporary. What remains after it passes is something that didn't exist before. A small specific piece of evidence that you can trust yourself. That evidence accumulates, and accumulation over time becomes identity. Not the identity you performed, the one you built. The moment you realize what you've been doing, there is a specific kind of clarity that arrives quietly, not through a crisis, usually through an ordinary moment where something suddenly becomes visible that you cannot make invisible again. You see the pattern, not as an abstract concept you read about and recognized in others, but as a lived reality operating inside your own life. And the seeing changes things. Not immediately, not completely, but irreversibly. Most people who reach this moment describe a feeling that is equal parts relief and discomfort. Relief because something unnamed finally has a name. Discomfort because naming it means you can no longer claim you didn't know. The pattern that felt like personality, like instinct, like just the way you are, suddenly reveals itself as a choice. A long series of choices made so automatically that they stopped feeling like choices at all. Marcus Aurelius wrote in the Meditations, Book 10, that the first step toward correction is awareness, the capacity to observe your own patterns with honesty. He was not speaking about self-criticism. Awareness is not the same as judgment. Seeing clearly is not the same as condemning what you see. What you are doing in this moment, recognizing the pattern, tracing its shape, understanding its cost, is not failure. It is the beginning of something different. Think about the decisions you made in the last month, not the major ones, the small daily ones. How many of them were made from your own center? And how many were filtered, even slightly, through the question of how they would be received? How many times did you know what you wanted and pause, not because you were uncertain, but because you were waiting for an implicit signal that it was acceptable to want it? That pause is what you have been doing, and seeing it clearly is not comfortable. But you cannot leave a room you haven't admitted you're in. The years of seeking, the accumulated adjustments, the slow drift from your own voice, none of that is evidence of weakness. It is evidence of a human being doing what human beings do, responding to the conditions they were given with the tools they had available at the time. What changes now is not the past. What changes is what you do with the awareness you didn't have before. Most people never reach it. Most people spend their entire lives inside the pattern, feeling its effects without ever identifying its source. You have identified it, and that changes what is possible. Stop asking, start standing. There is no announcement required. When most people decide they are done seeking validation, the first instinct is to declare it, to make it known. But that impulse, the need to announce the decision, to have it witnessed, to receive confirmation that the change is real, is still the same pattern in different clothing. It is still performing, still waiting for the audience to respond before the thing feels legitimate. Real change in this direction is quiet. It does not need to be seen to be real. What it actually requires is something far more difficult than a declaration. It requires you to speak when the discomfort of speaking is fully present, to make the decision without running it past the people whose approval you have been using as a compass, to hold your position in a conversation, not aggressively, not rigidly, but with the calm steadiness of someone who has already decided that their own judgment is worth standing in, while the pull to yield is still active. That pull will be there. Do not expect it to disappear. Epictetus was specific about this in the Discourses, Book 1, Chapter 2. He described the person of genuine character not as someone who feels no pull toward external approval, but as someone who has learned to act from their own center, regardless of that pull. The practice is not the elimination of the feeling. The practice is the action taken in the presence of the feeling. Because if you wait until you no longer feel the urge to seek approval before you act differently, you will wait a very long time. So, what does this actually look like in the real texture of an ordinary day? It looks like saying the true thing in the conversation, not the softened version, and then tolerating the silence that follows without rushing to fill it with reassurance. It looks like making the decision without sending it out for review first. And it looks like sustaining silence when someone expects an explanation you do not owe them. Because over-explaining before anyone has questioned you is one of the subtler forms of seeking approval. Marcus Aurelius wrote in the Meditations, Book 3, that it is enough to act with integrity now, even if it will be forgotten. The action does not require an audience to validate it. The meaning is in the alignment between what you value and how you act. Self-respect does not begin when you finally feel confident. It begins when you act consistently with your own values, in the moments when confidence is not available. The confirmation that it is acceptable to be exactly who you are was never available from outside. It was always something built from within, one honest moment at a time. You don't need approval to exist. You never did. That is the truth underneath everything this video has been building toward, not a motivational statement. A factual observation about something that was always true, and that the approval-seeking pattern, layer by layer, year by year, taught you to forget. You were not born monitoring the room. You were not born editing yourself before you spoke. That architecture was built, piece by piece, through experiences that taught you, convincingly and repeatedly, that your unfiltered self required management before it was safe to present to the world. and you believed it. Not because you were naive, because the lessons came early, and they came from people and environments whose opinions felt like reality. But a lesson learned is not the same as a truth discovered. Marcus Aurelius wrote in the Meditations, Book 5, that the rational soul is its own standard. It does not require external measurement to know its own value. Your worth was never located in their response. It was always located in you, in the quality of your thinking, in the consistency of your choices, in the degree to which you lived in alignment with what you actually believed. None of that requires an audience. None of it becomes more real because someone approved of it. None of it disappears because someone didn't. Epictetus asked his students something that still cuts through everything. He said, "If someone handed your body over to a stranger to be used and directed according to that stranger's preferences, you would call it an outrage. And yet every day you hand your mind over to whoever happens to disapprove of you. You allow their reaction to determine your inner state. You give them freely and repeatedly the kind of authority over your inner life that you would never consciously grant to anyone. The seeking was not a strategy, it was a surrender. And what was surrendered, your own capacity to determine your worth from the inside, was the one thing no one else could ever have given you anyway. Approval can give you relief. It can give you a temporary reduction in anxiety. But it cannot give you the groundedness that comes from knowing your own value, independent of anyone's response. That kind of knowing is built from the inside, through action, through consistency, through the repeated experience of meeting yourself honestly and choosing to stand in that encounter rather than flinch away from it. Seneca wrote in his letters to Lucilius, Letter 1, that we should reclaim our own time, gather it, preserve it. He understood that the most valuable thing a person possesses is not their reputation or the approval they have accumulated. It is their own inner life, their own capacity to be present to themselves honestly, without performance. You are not recovering something you lost. You are returning to something you were always carrying, beneath everything that was placed on top of it. The pattern was learned. What is learned can be unlearned. The belief was absorbed. What was absorbed can be examined, held up to the light, and quietly set down. So the only question that actually matters as this ends is not whether you are capable of this. You are. The question is this: if you stop seeking validation today, if you make the quiet, unglamorous, deeply personal decision to stop handing your inner life over to the reactions of people who were never appointed to determine your worth, who do you finally allow yourself to be? Not the edited version, not the adjusted one, the real one, the one that existed before the pattern began. That person was never missing. They were simply waiting for you to stop looking for permission to let them exist. And they never needed anyone's approval to be real, they never did.